All right, welcome back to Tasting at Cross Keys. I'm Steve, winemaker here, and excited this week to try a few of some very special wines that I picked. Kind of the more interesting, some of the wines that we think are really special, not really in the main production here, but some things that are unique and kind of show off both me as a winemaker, the vineyard as a site, and also just kind of the age and the evolution of the winery. The most exciting news, of course, is that today is our first day coming back open in phase one. So please come out and visit, reservations only. We're open Wednesday through Sunday, and we look forward to having you for both food and wine. We got plenty of space, everybody can spread out and enjoy themselves, and hopefully the weather improves. Looks like it will this weekend, and we can have have some good time outside of the house for the first time in a while. So we look forward to seeing you, and like I said, please call ahead for reservations. So a little bit about the three wines that I selected were two of these are reserve wines, which is something that we just recently started. We kind of start the process of reserve years ago, but we let these wines mature and age until they're ready for release. So they're both relatively recently released, but the XX was made in 2016 and the Viognier in 2018. So they have some age on them. We like to hold on to these wines and make sure that they're ready to drink before they're available. And then the last wine is the 2012 Tavern. Tavern is our port style wine. We age it extensively in the barrel. It spends at least 2 years in the barrel before it's released. But what's really cool about the port style dessert red wines is that they can just age and age and age and age. It is not uncommon to see collectors with 100-year-old bottles of port. So you can definitely put this one away, save it for a special occasion. It's really interesting to see how it evolves. It's a totally different aging style when there's brandy involved. So we'll talk about that, kind of the process of what makes that wine unique and special when we get to it. But first, let's start with the Viognier. And so we first harvested Viognier in 2016. Some of you might have been lucky enough to get, I think we did 29 cases the very first year, so not very much the first year. And then we started producing more in 2017. And the vineyard was relatively new. We hadn't really worked with the grape very much. So we started to experiment with barrel fermentations, stainless steel fermentations. We have special barrels called modern cooperage barrels. They're very unique, kind of a new technology in barrels that we also experimented with in 2017. And one thing that we found is that we were really leaning towards a reductive style of winemaking. And reduction, oxidation is just the oxygen status of the wines. And so Viognier has a lot of great aromatics. Traditionally, it's a little low on acidity, so it can be a little flat if you're not careful. But to really get those aromatics, you have to really let it ripen. And what we found was that we really preferred the wines that were picked a little bit earlier, that had the greater amount of acidity. But if we made them in kind of that classic Viognier style, the wines didn't show an aromatic intensity. But with the modern cooperage barrels, they're stainless steel 300-liter barrels. We were able to ferment inside of those barrels, which gave us good contact with the yeast, so we got a good rich mouthfeel. But at the same time, we were able to shift the aromatic profile to more reductive. So instead of this ripe peach, cobbler kind of aromatics that you might find typically in Viognier, we went more towards green apple, melon, almost a little grassiness. And it was so attractive that we decided to take those two barrels, experimental barrels, and bottle them separately, and that's where the reserve came from. So really it's the aromatics and the flavors in this wine that make it unique and special. It's a different style of Viognier than you typically find in Virginia. It's acid focused. It's got aromatics more akin to a Sauvignon Blanc than it does kind of a big overripe Viognier. So on the nose, the first thing that pops out to me is kind of the fresh grass clippings, which is just a wonderful kind of fresh, herby note to it, along with this kind of strong green apple as well. And I think what we found was in the oak barrels, even though they were neutral, they didn't have new oak flavor, they let a little bit more oxygen into the wine. and that yielded a totally different aromatic profile, which wasn't necessarily bad, but we just weren't getting the intensity. So we kind of shifted our focus and our desire for this reductive aromatic intensity. And those flavors carry through on the palate as well. It is crisp, herbal, savory, but still kind of this nice, almost on the palate, it's more like a lime, citrus notes to it. But what's really cool about the Viognier is that it typically has a little higher alcohol and a bigger mouthfeel than you find in other white wines, because it does get a little bit riper than other white wines. And what we were able to do, even though it was picked a little early, those special barrels we fermented it in, not only did they keep the oxygen away from the wine, they also allowed us to do really intensive lees stirring. And so after the yeast has finished its fermentation, it'll fall to the bottom of whatever vessel it's in. And you know, with a really light, crisp white wine, we'll take the clean wine off the top of the yeast very quickly, so the wine just kind of stays pure, just kind of light and crisp. But with the Viognier and those special barrels, they have a mechanism that allows us to stir them very, very easily. So these wines would be stirred 2-3 times a week for up to 6 months. And that really let us build out that mouthfeel. The yeast will, over time, release compounds from their cell walls that add richness to a wine. So even though it has a strong acidity, it's not too acidic. It's almost balanced by almost perception of sweetness, but that's really just the weight coming from the autolysis of the yeast inside that barrel. And while we are excited that we had the reserve in 2018, we'll see how the 19 works out. We really just shifted the entire production to become reserve. So we can look forward to 2019. It will be a lot more in this style. It got a little riper just because we had such an exceptional year. So there's definitely some more peachy notes to it, but it's still kind of like a white peach instead of like instead of like an apple. But still a wonderful, focused wine with good acidity, and once again focusing on building out that mouthfeel with those special barrels. All right, and then next is our Double X. So the history behind Double X is, once again, this came from varieties that we hadn't grown on the vineyard before. Until 2016 was the first harvest we had for both Tannat and Cabernet Sauvignon off of a couple new blocks. 2016 was a great year. Cab Sav ripened plenty early, younger vines. Tannat gets incredibly ripe very, very quickly. With Tannat, the key is just tasting the berries. We have to go out and literally eat berries until we can feel the tannins start to calm down. Tannat is called Tannat because it's so full of tannins. The root word for the grape and the bitterness in wine is the same. So a very, very intense red wine that you really have to be careful with those tannins. So we taste the berries and really chew up the skin is what we concentrate on. And as soon as that skin loses any papery notes that we might get, kind of that bittery copier paper, that's when we know that the tannins are getting mature enough to make wine from. So that happened relatively early with the Tannat. But the sugar was just climbing and climbing and climbing, so it ended up being quite a high alcohol wine with really a lot of tannins in it as well, and makes a very rustic style of wine. By rustic, I mean it's rough tannins. The aromatics are earthy and spicy. There's not a lot of fruit dimension to the Tannat, but the Cabernet Sauvignon we thought was a perfect match for it because it had nice silky tannins, and then a wonderful, just kind of jammy fruit notes to it. So as we tasted the barrels and started building our blends, we realized, both of these wines could use a little bit more time in barrel. They have tons of tannin. They might be a good match for each other. Originally, we thought Petit Verdot and Tannat might go together, but that was kind of when you actually put wines together, it's funny how they react. Sometimes the best ideas on paper come out and they just really fought each other like cats and dogs inside the glass. So we finally figured out that Cab Sav and Tannat love each other, and so we blended them and did some extended aging, which kind of makes it special. The name Double X comes from the fact that this wasn't in our planned production. We didn't have a reserve program yet, but we didn't want to let this wine, this texture, this kind of unique thing that we had get by us. So we did an extended aging. We didn't put a name on the barrel. I marked a couple X's on the tape and just kind of set it to the side as a special project. We bottled it the following year, so an extra year of aging on the wine, and no labels, just blank bottles, and we put it in the cellar because we knew it was such a big wine that it needed time both in the barrel and in the bottle to calm down and let those tannins integrate a little better. So this wine is unfined, unfiltered, raw, rustic, and now that we have time on it, we're starting to see this wine come to life. So once the wine got to the point where we thought it was starting to drink well, even though it's still quite a big wine, this is a wine built for aging. We kind of revealed it to the powers that be here at Cross Keys, and we decided that this will be our first reserve. So this wine was hidden away in the back of the cellar for 3 years before really anybody tasted it. So it's kind of a special project in that way. On the nose, the very first thing you get is this earthiness, smokiness. This has 50% new oak. We wanted the new oak to provide that vanilla and sweetness to the wine because it was a little bit more on the savory side with the tannat. And this wine really changes as it pours in the glass. When I first smelled it, it was just wet earth, and now it's really the fruit's starting to come through from that Cabernet. It's very complex. That's what this extra aging in the bottle has done. I'm getting cigar smoke, some pencil lead, some graphite. Very interesting on the nose. And then on the palate, it's wonderful. This wine was so aggressive in its youth that it really needed that extra time. And now it's really calmed down to the point where it seems like a really big wine. It fills my mouth up. I'm almost expecting it to be incredibly bitter just based on how dense it seems. But the finish now has become quite smooth. I get a lot of the oak characteristic on the palate, a lot of that vanilla, smoke, kind of burnt caramel notes. And I think that matches nicely to the earthiness. But really a full wine. This is a very rich wine that I think is kind of unique. It's one of the biggest feeling wines that we've ever produced here at Cross Keys. Then finally, the Tavern, that's our name for a port-style dessert wine. We can't say port here in the United States. Port is from Portugal. So this wine is inspired by the method and profile of Portuguese dessert port wines. And so kind of the typical profile you would see on this is the wine has high in alcohol, has some sugar, and then also is made with a pretty dense and big red wine. So in 2012, this was Touriga Nacional. We planted that grape specifically for our Tavern production. Now it's evolved a little bit, so we make a red Touriga as well. But really we look for that aromatic intensity, the tannins you get from Touriga, to kind of stand up to all the weight that's going to be there with the sugar and the alcohol. So traditionally, the alcohol is added to this wine in order to stop the fermentation. So once we get to the kind of the sugar level we're looking for, the brandy, wine will be pressed off and then settled. We try to get as much yeast out of it as possible, and then high proof brandy will go in. So the stuff we use is 155 proof. Normally what you buy at the store is 80 proof. So this stuff is quite strong, but so it doesn't take much to bump the alcohol up. But we get the alcohol up to about 17.5%, and what that does is it stops the fermentation and keeps the residual sugar in the wine. So that's the balance that we're shooting for when we make this wine. The brandy we use, you have to be very selective with it. You can really taste the brandy when it's young. It integrates over time, but we use a very high quality aged brandy that's wonderful. I mean, if you watered it down to normal drinking, it would be a great brandy, but as we use it, it is so strong that you could never really put it to your lips. But if you water it down to normal alcohol strength, it's got wonderful caramel notes from its aging in barrels. and that really complements well to the fruitiness you get from a wine that's not fully fermented. And here, the aromatics, you get the brandy, and I say that in a way of, I'm not smelling any of the actual heat from the brandy, it's just the vanilla from that aged brandy, and it's a wonderful complement to the fruit that's there as well. It has a bit of a leather note to it as well, almost like, but it still has good like strawberry. And one interesting thing we find with Touriga is that in the port style, it comes out almost as like an orange peel is one of the fruit notes that we get. So it's clove, cinnamon, orange peel. It's very holiday oriented flavor profile. So we have to be careful inside the winery to age it long enough with the brandy in order to incorporate the alcohol heat. So whenever we release the Tavern, it's already had enough aging on it for it not to seem too hot or even really taste the brandy separate from the wine. But what's interesting is that it just continues to integrate over time to the point where it's hard to nail this wine as a high alcohol wine. So you have to be a little bit careful because it is 30% more alcoholic than other wines, but it's so well integrated that it doesn't seem hot. There's not maybe a slight warming sensation, which is wonderful. It's what you want from a port, is to know that you're drinking a port style wine, but very smooth. The secondary bouquets coming out, like I said, it's that leather, pencil shaving, some of that dry notes that you get with time, and just a wonderfully balanced wine. The sweetness is, we typically do a little bit lower than traditional port wines. We don't want to have to make the alcohol so high that the sweetness gets so high, and it's kind of an arms race until you get this syrup of a wine. This is a very nicely balanced wine. Definitely has some sweetness, which makes it really versatile for food. It's hard to pair wine and anything sweet, but if you can match the sweetness in the wine, this would be like the perfect accompaniment for like a blackberry cobbler or something like that, where sometimes it can make your other wines seem too acidic. This would balance it out really nicely. That said, Tavern is almost always best enjoyed on its own. Unless you have a specific need for it, this is pour a glass, enjoy it, take your time with it. On a cold day, warm up a little bit. It's a wonderful way to kind of enjoy a glass of wine over a long period of time. And what's great about it too is you can open the bottle and leave it open for days before you really notice any deterioration in the wine. The alcohol is a good preservative for the wine. You don't have to worry too much about keeping it capped or drinking it in a night, whereas some other wines, it's an issue. And same thing with the aging. This is a bottle that you can put in your basement and forget about for literally 50 years, and it'll still be nice and drinkable when you open it back up. So those are the special wines. I'm glad you guys kind of got to see some of the more interesting things we do. We're looking forward to 2019 providing a few more reserves. We're still tasting and blending and figuring out, but there's definitely some special things down there. So we really look forward to in the future having some more of these interesting wines, wines that we can age separately that aren't released until we really think they're hitting their peak. And we hopefully you guys enjoy and can look forward to some of the new ones. So like I said, we are open. Please call for a reservation, check our website, social media. We've decided to keep doing these small tastings. We'll make an announcement about in next week about what we'll do next, and we've gotten such a good response. We really appreciate having everybody join in and taste some of our wines. And we will offer free shipping on 6 bottles or more on our website with the promo code CKB. So please come visit, please order some wine. We look forward to seeing you on the internet and in person finally. So thank you so much.